This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to the escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula and between the U.S. and North Korea. On Wednesday, South Korea said it expects North Korea to test launch another intercontinental ballistic missile on Saturday. The expected test comes after North Korea carried out its strongest ever nuclear test on Sunday. The underground nuclear blast was many times more powerful than the bomb the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, which killed 75,000 people.
The North's nuclear test came as U.S. and South Korea wrapped up their massive joint military drills on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has long objected to the annual drills, which include tens of thousands of troops. On Wednesday, a reporter asked President Trump if military action against North Korea is on the table.
We're going to see what happens. We'll see what happens. Certainly that's not our first choice, but we will see what happens. Thank you very much.
President Trump has also threatened to cut off trade with any countries that do business with North Korea. Experts say this proposal is next to impossible, since seizing trade with China, Brazil, Germany, Mexico and other countries would be an economic catastrophe for the U.S. Trump has also escalated tensions with the U.S.'s longtime ally, South Korea, for being open to initiating peace talks with the North. Trump has threatened to cancel a trade agreement between the two countries.
That's between the United States and South Korea. Meanwhile, hundreds of protesters clashed with police in South Korea's Sungju County Wednesday over the deployment of more THAAD missile launchers. Dozens of protesters were injured at the overnight standoff when police attempted to disassemble protesters' campsites and forcibly remove roadblocks. For more, we're joined by two guests. Wol-san joins us from Democracy Now! Video Stream, Director of International and Korean Peninsula Affairs, KCTU, Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union. Lim just came from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Tim Shurock, investigative journalist, author of Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Outsourced Intelligence. He grew up in Tokyo and Seoul, has been writing about the U.S. role in Korea since the late 70s, correspondent for The Nation and the Korea Center for Investigative Journalism in Seoul. His new piece for The Nation, Diplomacy with North Korea, has worked before and can work again. Tim Shurock, let's begin with you. Talk about the latest deployment. Not clear if North Korea tested a hydrogen bomb. They say they did. A number of experts say that it couldn't be. And then are going to once again test an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, this weekend. Is the U.S. and Korea, North Korea, on a collision course? And what do you think needs to happen?
Well, they're definitely on a collision course, yes. And this has been going on for quite some time now. You know, at the beginning of this year, 2017, Kim Jong-un declared in his January 1 speech that he wanted the country to be ready with a nuclear weapon that could be put on an ICBM by the end of the year. So these tests and this latest nuclear test do not come as much of a surprise, really. But what's been really dangerous has been this escalation of this war of words between the U.S. and North Korea, and these threats, especially by Trump and Secretary of Defense Mattis, you know, to destroy North Korea, to annihilate North Korea. These are very dangerous kinds of words to be using, and I think it's really raised the tensions to a point where we've, you know, there's got to be some kind of intervention, hopefully by some other country that can get this situation off of this, you know, moving toward war and moving towards some kind of peace talks and negotiations.
Well, you said, Tim Shurock, that a third country should intervene. Now, what country would have the trust of both the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, you know, Trump's been trying to rely on the Chinese to pressure North Korea, and I think there may be a possibility when the new U.S. sanctions come up in the UN Security Council, where China and Russia both, of course, have veto power, you know, for the Chinese or the Russians to come in and say they may support additional sanctions, but they will also push for some kind of peace negotiation, some kind of talk between the U.S. and North Korea, a diplomatic solution rather than war. That's what I mean. But I also think that the South Korean government of Moon Jae-in, has said from the beginning since his election that South Korea should be taking the lead in this, and they've been really eclipsed, partly by the fault of the U.S. policy, but I think Moon Jae-in has allowed that to happen as well. And they, of course, it's their country. They have the right to negotiate with North Korea, despite the fact that Trump called Moon Jae-in's appeal to diplomacy appeasement. So I think this intervention could come from China or Russia, but I think South Korea has a very important role to play as well.
Can you talk, Tim Shurak, about what you believe the North Korean president wants? What is he attempting to accomplish?
Well, I think at the least he wants to signal the United States that he has the military power to strike back at not only the U.S. in South Korea, but U.S. assets and bases in Japan, Okinawa, and Guam. The last threat he made, the last specific threat he made, of course, was a few weeks ago when he said they would send some missiles toward Guam. Now, why Guam? Well, because Guam is the base for B-1B bombers that the U.S. would use to attack North Korea in case of a war. And there's been exercises even in the past few days where they've flown these B-1s from Guam into Korean skies. So I think at the least he's trying to show that the United States, that he has the military capability to fight a war, as he says, in the Pacific region. And he's trying to get some kind of, military positioning himself, possibly for future negotiations.
Well, meanwhile, the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has said that North Korea is begging for war. And as we said earlier, the test that North Korea carried out was the strongest it ever has. Now, barring the intervention of a third country, Tim Shurak, where do you see this going?
Well, I think the people that are begging for war is CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, for that matter. I see the networks pushing for war. That's what they're dreaming of, I think. And you see a lot of pro-war sentiment in the U.S. media as well. Sentiment for regime change and this kind of thing. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. It's being heated up by a press that reports nonsense about North Korea and South Korea, for that matter. And Trump can take advantage of this. There's very little investigative reporting. For example, there's so much reporting about how large their missiles are and how far they can go, but very little attention on the mechanics of how a peace might work, how peace talks might proceed, what North Korea wants, what the U.S. wants, how that might work. That's what I tried to do in this article in The Nation, was to show the history of the U.S.-North Korean negotiations and show that the agreement made in the 1990s by President Clinton and Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, froze North Korea's nuclear program. They didn't have a bomb then, but they had a nuclear program. They froze it for 12 years, and they agreed both to move toward full diplomatic and economic relations. And that agreement was, broken during the Bush administration by the United States, and North Korea cheated on it as well. But both sides broke it. So in the mass media in the United States, it's always that this agreement went through and then North Korea broke it the next day. That is not true. The agreement lasted for many years, and it finally ended when the Bush administration falsely accused the North Koreans of having a uranium program to the bomb and just tore up the agreement. And it was after that that they proceeded very rapidly to build their nuclear bomb, and they exploded their first nuclear bomb in 2006 under Bush. So, I think that talks can work. it's not exactly clear how Kim Jong-un would react because he's very young. He has not had any negotiations, but he is certainly surrounded by people. His foreign minister has negotiated with the United States for many years as his deputy foreign minister, and there's people in his government who have decades of experience in diplomacy and have talked to the United States. So I think, diplomacy really is the only way. You can't have sanctions and tough policies without negotiations. That makes the situation worse.
We want to bring in Wol-san Lim into this conversation. Just came from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea, protesting militarization of the peninsula. Wol-san Lim, explain where you are right now in South Korea, what the THAAD is, and what you're calling for. So many in South Korea feel like they're at ground zero.
Thank you for having me on the show, and it's good to be here with Tim Shorak as well. The situation in Korea is that since last year, the United States and the South Korean government authorities and military authorities have been moving to deploy and have gone through with the deployment of this THAAD missile defense system, which is a missile defense system that is supposed to be designed to shoot down missiles, including nuclear warheads, in the terminal phase, and so as they enter. And the argument behind that from the United States and the South Korean government is that this is being used as a deterrent or as protection against North Korean, the threat of North Korean nuclear weapons. But there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that these missile defense is actually, in particularly THAAD, is actually not effective against most missiles, and particularly not from North Korean missiles that would be targeted at South Korea at such a short range. And one of the main issues here is that this missile is actually, it's a weapon system, really, because it's part of a larger strategy for U.S. Military buildup in the region. It's being deployed in a small village in the Seongju County, which is about three hours outside of Seoul, south of Seoul. And it's an area where it's a farming village. There's a lot of elderly people who live there, and they're very concerned about the impact of the radar on their farming and on their environment, on their health. But they also have recognized that this weapon system is actually exacerbating tensions between South Korea and North Korea, and then also with China, who feels very threatened by the fact that you can use the system, in fact, the radar that is part of the system, to monitor the entire Chinese airspace as well as North Korea. And so there's been quite a strong protest from the residents in that area, supported by peace activists from around the country, to stop the deployment. Unfortunately, the U.S. military and Korean government just moved through with deploying 4 more launchers to complete a THAAD unit there. So there's 6 launchers that are now stationed. And so it was a really passionate struggle, but one that, we weren't able, in fact, to block the equipment from being brought into the deployment site.
And Wol-san Lim, can you comment on the way that President Trump has been responding to this crisis with North Korea?
I mean, I definitely echo what Tim just said. I think it's incredibly dangerous, the war of words, the threat of preemptive strike, which Trump has preemptive nuclear strike, which Trump has referenced several times, or other, raining fire and fury down on North Korea. It clearly exacerbates the situation, and I think that because Trump is really unpredictable and does things that are not so calculated, sometimes it makes the situation even more dangerous. I wanted to mention that this is really, and I think that Tim also alluded to it, but this is really the crisis that we're experiencing now. While it's exacerbated by the Trump administration incredibly, it's also part of a product of a long-term history of the United States hostile policies towards North Korea, stemming back from the Cold War. And so North Korea's nuclear development, while I definitely don't want to justify it, it is the result of a sense of a threat that the United States will at some point use nuclear weapons or conventional weapons against it to try to achieve regime change. This is because the United States maintains a policy of preemptive strike against North Korea, and because of the war exercises that you mentioned conducted with South Korea every year that particularly target the target of the exercises is an attack on the North Korean leadership. And so because of that, this understandable sense, if you think about it, this understandable sense of threat, North Korea has felt that unless it wants to be another Iraq, it has to develop nuclear weapons in order to have some kind of defense against much greater power that is the United States. And what the North Korea ultimately wants is normalization of relations and a peace treaty to end the conflict on the Korean Peninsula. There was, at the end of the Korean War in 1953, there was an armistice signed, not a peace treaty. And so, in fact, there's still a state of war going on, and North Korea has been explicit that it wants a peace treaty and normalization of relations.
Well, Wol-san Lee, we want to thank you for being with us just back from protesting at the THAAD deployment site in South Korea, speaking to us from Seoul, and Tim Shurock joining us from Washington, D.C., investigative journalist. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to look at what's happening in Burma, where more than 150,000 Rohingya of Muslim minority fleeing Burma into Bangladesh. Is there a genocide happening? Stay with us.